If you're just coming back to school, welcome back. It's great to have you here. If you're a parent, welcome to you. And we're just so happy that you're here. School has started. We were on campus this last week. Cole and Alexa, they lead our campus ministry, doing an amazing job. And it's exciting to see all the freshmen coming back and all the parents as well. And seeing all the happy parents and people coming back in their U of A gear. It was awesome. Do you have a nickname? Is there a name that maybe only your family calls you? Okay, I'm seeing some serious head nodding going on. It's funny what nicknames we have in our family. One of my sons went to camp one summer, and then we moved to a different city at the end of the summer. And so he joined the football team, and there was another person with the same name as him. This was David. And so he said, you can just call me what they called me at camp, which is Skip. And so all through high school, my son David was known as Skip Skinner. In fact, when we went back, we went for a week to see, back to that town where we were living. We met an old friend there who had a boat and was taking us around. We were water skiing and stuff. And it was just so funny because he was like, hey, Skip, what's up? So good to see you. Gave me a great big hug. I hadn't heard that name in like 10 years. It's funny how names can change. I'm gonna just embarrass my other son here. This is tough being a preacher kid, but I'm gonna go ahead and do it anyway. James's name is James Edward Skinner. It's J-E-S. And I always told him he's like halfway to Jesus, J-E-S. He's almost there. Anyway, he had his name, his initials on his backpack, J-E-S. And when he was in like third grade or fourth grade, there was another kid with the same name, James. So guess what his nickname became for the whole year? Jess, not Jesus, Jess. Luckily, it wasn't Jesus. That'd be a tough act to follow. But he was known as Jess, and those kids who grew up with him, they called him Jess. Hey, Jess, what's up? We're like, who's Jess? But we're going to take a look at a man in the book of Genesis whose name changed. His name was transformed. Not only did his name change, it wasn't just a nickname, his whole character changed. His whole demeanor changed. Everything about him changed. And God worked to bring about a transformation. His name started as Jacob, which means deceiver or tricker or tripper, and it became Israel. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. So let's start in Genesis 35, verse 1 through 15. And if this is your first day here, we've been going through the book of Genesis, but don't worry, there's still 15 chapters, so you're not really missing too much. We still got a lot of stuff to cover. Okay, Genesis 35. Then God said to Jacob, go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go up to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. Then they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them. Jacob and all the people with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. There he built an altar, and he called the place El Bethel, because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak outside Bethel. So it was named Elon Bakuth. After Jacob returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you. and kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you. And I will give this land to your descendants after you." Then God went up from him at the place where he talked with him. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it. Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel. If you've been here and you've been following this story arc of this man, Jacob, it's really interesting because he started out as a very different character. And you see that a lot in TV shows, from Breaking Bad, kind of goes in the opposite direction, this transformation of a person, from good to bad. That one's bad to good, or no, good to bad. But Jacob really starts with a very weak character, very distorted character, and becomes a totally different person. In verse 2 there, though, Jacob says something very interesting. God talks to him and says, "Okay, I want you to go up to Bethel, where I originally revealed myself to you." Bethel's about 1,000 feet higher than where he was in Shechem. And what's interesting is that all of a sudden, Jacob, unprompted, says, "Listen, get rid of your gods." He tells all of his family, all of the people around him, says, "Get rid of your gods. Purify yourselves and change your clothing." That was totally unprompted. God didn't tell him to do that, didn't say, "Hey, this is what I want you to do." But it's a reminder of what happened in Joshua chapter 24 when they were crossing the Jordan River later in the story of Israel. In Joshua 24:14, do we have that next slide there? Yes, there we go. "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord." So these are some of Joshua's last words to Israel. And he tells the Israelites, he says, throw away your gods. Throw away your gods. And that's what Jacob does hundreds of years before that. Now, what's he talking about? Jacob's clearly a believer in God, so is his family. But he speaks up about something, a dirty little secret that's going on. There are other gods in the family and in his entourage. Probably included the gods that Rachel stole in chapter 31. Again, it's like a running joke. It's laughable because these gods, they can be stolen, they can be sat on, they can be stained with menstrual blood, they can be buried. These gods are not super strong. And he says, "I want you to get rid of them." And so Jacob initiates this, and it's a sign of his spiritual transformation. He's becoming a spiritually strong and powerful man. And it's a sign of his total transformation. Jacob had allowed these quote-unquote gods to remain in his family and among his workers. It's not easy when you've had a really low bar spiritually to all of a sudden just raise that bar midstream. I mean, he's a mature man at this point. He's I don't know, 60s, 70s, 80s, who knows how old he is. But it's one thing to do it at the beginning of your faith journey, to make a change when you're young. People expect changes when you're young. But here he is as an older man saying, "Listen, I want to get rid of all of the gods that are here in the family. I want to get rid of it all." I want to talk to you parents, because sometimes we think, I don't think the kids really are aware of my dirty little secrets, but they know. And we wonder, do they know what I've really got going on in my life? And guess what? They do. And that's why it's hard to say, "Hey, you need to change, son," or "You need to change, daughter." You know why? Because you're compromised. It's really tough if you know that there's stuff going on in your life to all of a sudden make a change midlife. It's really, really challenging. And that lack of decisiveness in Jacob's life infected his family and his boys later on in the story. Later in this chapter, we're not going to have time to read it, but his firstborn Reuben ends up sleeping with one of his concubines, one of Jacob's concubines. It's a power play. It's like Absalom sleeping with the concubines of David. And it's just the remnant of him allowing sin to go on in his family for a long period of time. And a lot of it's because he's compromised. He's allowed these, he's known these gods are there. His wife Rachel had some gods. He knows his kids got them. They've got earrings that they're going to turn into gods. But he's allowed it for a long time. In 1 John chapter 2, it says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world." It's not that Jacob and his family didn't believe in God. It was just God plus other gods, plus other things. What are we talking about? Anything you love or passion could be pleasure, could be comfort, could be people and their opinions. That could be your God. Could be money, pornography, food, could be alcohol or drugs. All of these things we've got going on the side, and it's tough all of a sudden to say, hey, let's put those away. It's really tough. And it's really tough because you know that if you're an adult, and I'm talking to you parents, you know that your kids know how you've been acting. And so for you all of a sudden just say, hey, kids, don't do that. They're like, hey, what about you, Dad? You've been doing this for the last 6 months. And you know what you do? You do what Jacob did for years and years. You just zip up. You go silent. And that's what shows the transformation about Jacob. Here at this point, he says, I'm not living that way anymore. Get rid of your gods. Parents, what's going on in your private life? You want your kids to do great spiritually? You want them to just be cranking? It's time to get rid of your gods first. You got to take a little inventory and go, what do I need to change? Maybe that little drinking habit I got, it's time to just put that away. Maybe that little swearing that just, you think that the kids can't hear you as you're just swearing up a storm. Guess what? Maybe you got cigarettes. My dad used to hide cigarettes under his floorboards in the car. It's like, what's this? Whatever it is, get rid of it first if you're going to call your kids to a transformation. It's tough. People are used to seeing you in a certain way, and homeostasis sets in. It's really cool. I want to talk a little bit to the younger crowd too, the students. It's awesome coming to school. No one knows you. No one knows your name. They don't know your nickname or your real name. They don't know what you're like or anything else. And you know what? You can define yourself. You can define it as you want. But if you don't decide exactly what you stand for early, up front, it'll become real tough to get rid of those gods later. Because homeostasis sets in, which is the tendency to stay the same way. There's inertia. All your friends view you as the party dude or the party girl. And they go, hey, what changed? What's going on? And it's really, really tough to change later. A lot of times we're just not aware of the things that are driving our behavior. And we feel like there's something I need to change. I just don't know exactly what it is. That's why the fact that you're here at church makes a huge difference. Because you're in an environment where you can really take a look and go, okay, what's really driving my life? What are the gods in my life? Jacob goes on here, and it's interesting because he recalls Bethel at the point, as the point at which God called him in his day of distress. He says, God called me. He answered me when I really needed him, when I was in absolutely my worst spot. Now, God just says that was the time that you were fleeing from your brother. But for Jacob, it was something that totally transformed it and bonded him with God because he knew he was at the lowest point of his life. He was in fear for his life, and God rescued him. And that's the big why that was driving the change in Jacob's life and turned him into the man Israel. In verse 5, let's go back to 35, verse 5. It says there, that the terror of God is on the people all around Jacob. Remember, the sons had just killed an entire town. That was like last chapter. They'd gone in and massacred everybody. Well, Jacob was really worried that those, all the surrounding people were going to kill them. But when Jacob said, put away your gods, all of a sudden something transformed and something changed his group. Everyone else became terrified of these Israelites. And up until this time, Jacob, think about it, he spent his entire life living in fear, insecurity. He's been fearful of his brother Esau. He's been fearful of his uncle Laban. He's been fearful of God. He's had the fear of God on him. And he's been afraid of other people as well. I mean, it's just everything has been insecurity and fear. Now, if you're a person that wrestles with insecurity, you know what I'm talking about. Everything makes you nervous. Every person, every situation, you're just on guard constantly. There's always a low-lying tension. That's the way Jacob has lived his life. But when he made this decision and said, listen, get rid of those other gods, the terror of God didn't fall on him, but on all the people around him. Everything was completely reversed. That's the power. That's what happens when you give up your gods. There's a power when you give yourself to God completely. It blows people away. In Acts chapter 5, that's the exact thing that was going on in the early church. Why were they so effective? Why were people becoming Christians in great number? You know why? Because they had just decided, hey, there's no other God but Jesus. They're totally given over to him, 100% heart and soul devoted to Jesus in their hearts and mind. No other side gods. The apostles performed many signs and wonders among the people, and all the believers used to meet together in Solomon's colonnade. No one else dared join them, even though they were highly regarded by the people. Nevertheless, more and more men and women believed in the Lord and were added to their number. That early church, people were afraid to join because they knew these people were sold out for their relationship with Jesus. They're like, well, I don't think I can really be a part of that group. Nevertheless, it was also, counterintuitively, super attractive because they felt like these people are really into it. They really believe it. It's been interesting reaching out and tabling on campus, talking to people, and I'll just ask people, hey, what's your spiritual background? Or where are you at in your spiritual journey? Just a conversation starter. And a lot of times people say, I'm a Christian, but I'm just kind of like a freewheeling Christian. Or I'll say, like, where are you at? Like, if one is like, I'm not close to God at all, or number 10, I'm really close to Jesus, where are you at? Like, oh, I don't know, like 4 or 5, just somewhere in there. I'm a Christian, but I'm just like, right in the middle. That describes so many people's lives. Essentially, what you're saying is that, yeah, Jesus is my main God, but I got some side gods. And I just kind of mix them all together. And you know what the result is? No power, no distinctiveness, no passion, no joy, no genuine enthusiasm. And guess what? No one cares. No one can sense that you're any different from anybody else on the campus or in this world. The early Christians were totally different. You know why? Because they gave up their gods. They said, Jesus is the only God for me. In chapter 35, verse 7, Jacob renames this place. He calls it El Bethel, God of the house of God. Appropriate in renaming it because in verse 10, his own name is changed to Israel. So lots of names changed, lots of Bethels in the Bible, but he changes his name. And then in verse 8, Deborah, who's Rebekah's nurse, she passes away. It's interesting because Rebekah, Jacob's mom, is not mentioned. It makes you wonder, is that like punishment because she was involved in all of the trickery to, basically steal the blessing from her other son, Esau, because she never got to see Jacob again. I mean, she sent him away, but she never got to see him again. Jacob's story begins with the birth of two people, Jacob and Esau, chapter 25. And it ends with the death of two people, Rachel and Deborah. So there's this birth and then this death. And kind of ends the story and the focus on Jacob, and it starts to shift to Joseph in chapter 37. But Jacob's life, after seeing God in chapter 32, when he wrestles with God, like Dom talked about a few weeks ago, it's filled with tragedy. Esau, he has to face Esau, which is terrifying. He has to wrestle with God, of course. Dinah gets raped. Deborah dies. His favorite wife, Rachel, dies. Isaac dies, his father. I mean, it's just a lot of tragedy. And then it keeps going. His favorite son, Joseph, gets sold into slavery. So there's a lot of hardship that's going on in his life. But the thing we got to keep in mind is that a lot of this hardship is the crucible that transformed this guy's character. Totally transformed who he was. We're going to talk more about that. But the suffering totally transformed him into a different person. So, God in verse 10, 35 verse 10, God renames Jacob Israel. And after facing and reconciling with Esau, he's ready for a new name. Not only does Jacob bury foreign gods, in a way, he buries his old identity as Jacob. And Jacob is a really popular name, but the root of it is very interesting because it means he deceives, or he trips, or it's because he was grasping the heel of his brother. It's like an expression for just a cunning and crafty, kind of a tricky person. So it would be like if your nickname, everyone knew you as Tricky Dick. Okay, there have been people named that before, presidents. Or Slick Willie. Like, how'd you like to be known? Hey, what's your name? Oh, my name's Slick Willie. I don't think I want to do business with you. If that were your name your whole life, now it was his name. I mean, if your name was just Deceiver. What's your name? Deceiver. Oh, how'd you get that name? Oh, it's a long story. And Jacob, James is the descendant of Jacob. But anyway, it's an interesting combination. Jacob, James, those are connected. So he's got this name shackled around his neck. That's who he is. But God says, you know what? You've changed so much. I've got a different name for you, Israel. And that name means he struggles with God, or he sees God. I mean, there's different interpretations, or God perseveres, maybe because God persevered with this guy, or one who prevails with God. And so his second name is awesome, and it's still think about this guy. The name Israel, everyone knows it, but it started out as such a bad person in many ways. Now that should give you hope, because sometimes we go, I'm not a very spiritual person. I got a ton of sin in my life. I got a lot of character weaknesses. But you know what's amazing about God? He perseveres. And so Jacob could have just felt like, hey, I'm the grandson of the greatest spiritual man in history up until now, Abraham. That'd be a tough legacy to live up to, wouldn't it? And your dad's not too shabby either, Isaac. Abraham, Isaac, and then there's the liar, the deceiver, in the third generation. But because God persevered with him, he changed him. And that's where we need to give hope. You can change too. Your name can change. Your identity can change. You can be a completely different person. That's why I just love, it's like so awesome to see Abraham get baptized last Sunday. Love to see when people repent, get baptized, they get their sins forgiven, they start over. And in a way, they get a brand new identity. Not in a way, in a very powerful way. Because all of a sudden, they're no longer who they were, a sinner, separated from God. All of a sudden, they become a child of God. And that's what Abraham became. Sometimes it's interesting, we will literally change people's names when they get baptized. When we planted a church in Portland, Oregon back in the early 90s, There was a young woman who was an immigrant from China. She was from Hong Kong. And so we were baptizing her, and I said, listen, I know your name is Natalie. Now's a good time if you want to be called something else. I know Natalie's not your given name, it's your English name. Is there another name that you'd like to be called now that you're getting baptized? It's a good time to make a change. And she goes, my real name is Ching Ching. And so from that moment on, everyone in the church called her Ching Ching. It was awesome because she was a brand new person. And just a reminder, listen, if you want to start over, one of the best things you can do is repent and get baptized. Later, I have a little postscript to that story. She grew up spiritually, she became a missionary. We moved to Japan and we said, hey, Ching Ching, why don't you move to Japan? And so she said, I'd love to do that. So she moved to Japan, and I was so fired up. I told all my Japanese friends, I said, hey, I'm just so fired up because this woman that we baptized in Portland is moving to Japan. They said, what's her name? And I said, Ching Ching. And it just went dead silent. I go, hey guys, what's going on here? And Ching Ching in Japanese is a bad word. I won't tell you which bad word, but it's bad. Okay. So when she crossed the Pacific Ocean, she became Natalie again. Sometimes it changes back. Anyway, let's get back on track here spiritually. So Jacob has struggled with God and his biggest fears and challenges, and he ends up changing into a different person. And he takes on the image of his forefathers, Abraham and Isaac, great men of faith. And he's able to call others to give up their gods. I want you to be inspired that no matter where you're at in your spiritual journey, your life can totally change. It won't be easy. There's going to be a lot of struggle. There's going to be a lot of pain. But the process that God works in your life is going to totally change you entirely. It reminds me of this story. One day a man found a cocoon of an emperor moth. He took it home so that he could watch the moth come out of the cocoon. He sat and watched the moth struggling to force the body through that little hole. Then it seemed to stop making any progress. It appeared as if it had gotten as far as it could, and it could go no farther. It just seemed to be stuck. Then the man, being kind, decided to help the moth. So he took a pair of scissors and he snipped off the remaining bit of the cocoon. The moth then emerged easily, but it had a swollen body and small, shriveled wings. He expected that the wings would enlarge and expand to be able to support the body, which would contract in time. Neither happened. In fact, the little moth spent the rest of its life crawling around with a swollen body and shriveled wings. It never was able to fly. A few days later, it died. What the man, in his kindness and haste, did not realize was that the restricting cocoon and the struggle required for the moth to get through the tiny opening was the way of forcing fluid from the body of the moth into the wings, so that it would be ready for flight once it achieved its freedom from the cocoon. Freedom and flight would only come after the struggle. By depriving the moth of a struggle, he deprived the emperor moth of health. For many of us, we're not willing to really go through the struggle that God wants to allow us to go through to become the spiritual, mighty men and women he envisions for us. We just run from it. God says, hey, why don't you give that up? Why don't you just take that challenge? Why don't you sacrifice a little here? Like, no, I don't want to do it. And we end up shriveled in our walk with God. We go, I really should be farther along. I'm getting up there in age. I really should be up here. How come I still can't fly? When you run from the struggle, you're running from growth. When you give up your gods and really make Jesus your only Lord, you get a new name. child of God. You're a force to be reckoned with. You create, you bring life to other people through the power of Jesus. People notice you, they sense something different about you. They go, oh, that person is just not like everybody else. They can feel the power and the peace that radiates from you. When you decide to make God your only God, you get conviction rather than wavering. You get confidence rather than insecurity. You get character rather than conformity to the people around you, to your environment. You are a person who stands out and makes a difference. Don't keep living in fear, in failure, in frustration. Get rid of your gods. I want to leave you some next steps. Number one, get rid of your gods. Figure out, it's probably Jesus plus some other gods. It's time to get rid of those other things and make Jesus your only God. Number two, raise the bar in your family. I want to talk to you parents. It's time to say, listen, I know I've been this way up until now. Hey, forgive me. I know it's been wrong. I know I've really messed up. I'm sorry. But it doesn't make it right. It's time to get rid of our gods. Just face it. Don't hide. Raise the bar in your family if you want your kids to do well spiritually. Jacob had a lot of problem with his kids. And one of the biggest problems is he took so long to take a stand. And finally, ignore those who want you to remain the same. And come back next week, get to know God, and get rid of your other gods. Thank you very much.